Hey guys, and welcome back. Tonight, we're going to begin with something a little less academic and a lot more, well, herbal. We're going to light a little candle in our minds and take a slow, winding trip through the foggy, fragrant world of medieval intoxication. Forget what you think you know about this era being all piety and piousness. It turns out the past was a lot stranger and more colourful than the history books often let on. Oh yes, they absolutely did it. Getting high is not a modern invention, not by a long shot. But trust me when I say, things got incredibly weird and sometimes surprisingly creative back then. You have to remember, this was a time when your main hobbies were avoiding the plague, arguing about the finer points of feudalism, and trying not to get drafted into a pointless war. So, finding a way to check out for a little while, that was a top priority for a lot of people. So, before you get too comfortable and drift off, if you enjoy these little late-night history sessions, please take a quick moment to like the video and subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel more than you know. And as always, I love seeing our community grow, so let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Alright, now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's so easy to picture the Middle Ages as this grim, mud-covered parade of misery. We imagine grey skies, bland food, and people who were just sort of waiting for the Renaissance to show up and invent colour. But that's a caricature, a faded old painting of a much more vibrant reality. Because under all that scratchy wool and existential despair, there were regular, flawed, curious and experimental people. People just like us, but with worse sanitation. These were folks who would occasionally look at a strange root growing in the forest, notice its weird shape, and think, well, let's see what happens if I drink this with some hot wine. It was a spirit of inquiry, just with potentially much more terrifying side effects. And honestly, who could blame them? Try to put yourself in their shoes for a second. There was no electricity, so when the sun went down, that was pretty much it. There was no coffee to kickstart your day, no antidepressants, and the local entertainment was either watching a knight try to read a book, which could take all afternoon, or maybe wondering how long your neighbour could keep dancing before collapsing from a mysterious illness. Life lacked a certain stimulation, so if a travelling herbalist or a village wise woman told you there was a mushroom that could make you forget the feudal system for a few hours, you'd probably chew it too. This wasn't always about partying or getting wasted in the modern sense. More often than not, it was a desperate search for an escape hatch from a reality that was often brutal, painful, and short. It was a quest for a different kind of consciousness in a world that offered very little control. So, let's talk about the big three players on the medieval psychedelic scene: henbane, mandrake, and belladonna. These weren't just random weeds you'd pull out of your garden. They were the absolute rock stars of the psychoactive plant world. All of them belong to the nightshade family, which should be your first clue that you're not dealing with a friendly salad ingredient. These plants were powerful, dangerous, and held a place of both fear and reverence in the medieval imagination. Take henbane, for example. This was not a plant for a gentle, relaxing evening. Its effects were notoriously intense, capable of causing wild hallucinations, a profound sense of delirium, and, most famously, the sensation of flying. It was a key ingredient in so-called witches' flying ointments, greasy salves that were rubbed onto the skin. And when you realize that these ointments could make you feel like you were soaring through the night sky, a lot of those old stories about broomsticks start to make a whole lot more sense. Then you have the legendary mandrake, the one with the root that eerily resembles a small, twisted human being. The folklore around this plant was off the charts. People genuinely believed that when you pulled a mandrake root from the ground, it would let out a blood-curdling scream, a shriek so powerful it could instantly kill anyone who heard it. They even had elaborate rituals involving tying a dog to the plant to pull it out for them, sacrificing the poor animal to get the magical root. But if you survived the harvest, mandrake was a potent sedative and a powerful hallucinogen. Consuming it, even in small amounts, was said to induce a death-like trance, a state of suspended animation where your heartbeat would slow and your body would grow cold. It was famous for blurring the line between the living and the dead for a few terrifying hours, a journey to the underworld from which you might not return. And finally, there was belladonna, whose name literally means beautiful lady in Italian. It earned this name because women in the Renaissance would use drops from the plant to dilate their pupils, which was considered alluring and attractive at the time. But belladonna was a fickle friend. Take just a little bit too much, and you're not just looking pretty for your date. You're having a full-blown, 3-hour conversation with a garden gnome that only you can see. And let's be crystal clear, these were not gentle trips. The accounts we have from this period don't sound like peaceful, mind-expanding journeys. Users reported seeing terrifying visions of monstrous beasts and demonic figures. They described the horrifying sensation of their soul literally detaching and leaving their body. This wasn't Woodstock in a field of flowers. This was a one-on-one horror movie being projected directly onto the inside of your skull. But it wasn't all just reckless, thrill-seeking experimentation. There was a science to it, albeit a medieval one. Herbalists and healers, who were very often women, carefully studied these plants. They were the pharmacists of their day, and they understood the razor-thin line that separated a cure from a curse. They knew the precise dosage that could ease pain, the amount that could induce visions, and the dose that would send you on a trip you'd never come back from. Of course, sometimes things could go horribly wrong without anyone even trying to get high. Danger could be lurking in the most mundane, everyday staple, your daily bread. I want you to meet ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and other grains, especially after a cold winter and a wet spring. When people unknowingly baked and ate bread from this tainted grain, it caused a horrific condition we now call ergotism. But back then, they didn't have a scientific name for it. They called it by a much more terrifying one, St. Anthony's fire. One form of the illness was gangrenous, constricting blood flow to the extremities. Victims would feel an unbearable burning sensation in their limbs, a feeling of being roasted alive from the inside out. Eventually, their fingers and toes would turn black, shrivel up, and simply fall off. But there was another version, the convulsive kind, that was arguably even more terrifying. This type of ergotism attacked the central nervous system. It led to mania, psychosis, and violent, uncontrollable muscle spasms. People would writhe, twitch, and babble incoherently, their minds filled with vivid hallucinations. Does that combination of spasms and hallucinations sound familiar? It should, because this brings us directly to one of the most bizarre events in European history, the Dancing Plague of 1518. It all kicked off in the city of Strasbourg, in modern-day France, and it started with just one person. A woman named Frau Trophia stepped out of her house one hot July day and just started dancing. She didn't have any music, she just silently, feverishly danced in the street. And she couldn't stop. Her husband begged her to rest, but she couldn't. She danced until she collapsed from exhaustion, only to get up and start again after a few hours of pained sleep. Within a week, a few dozen others had joined her, their bodies moving with the same frantic, involuntary energy. Within a month, there were hundreds of people dancing in the streets of Strasbourg. They weren't having fun. They were screaming in pain, their faces twisted in agony, begging for help. But their bodies just wouldn't quit. The city authorities were completely baffled. They consulted with local doctors who, in their infinite wisdom, diagnosed the problem as hot blood. Their best medical advice: the dancers just needed to dance it out of their systems. So, they did the most tragically unhelpful thing imaginable. They cleared out a guild hall, built a wooden stage in the town market, and even hired professional musicians to provide a soundtrack. encouraging the afflicted to keep moving. As you can imagine, this only made things worse. People already exhausted were now pushed even harder, and many literally danced themselves to death from heart attacks, strokes, and pure physical exhaustion. The results of this misguided policy were devastating. With music blaring and crowds watching, people literally danced themselves to death from heart attacks, strokes, and pure, unrelenting exhaustion. Their bodies just gave out. It remains one of history's most bizarre and terrifying mass hysterical events, a grim footnote that modern science now believes was almost certainly fueled by the mind-altering horror of ergot poisoning, turning a whole city into a deadly, involuntary dance marathon. But for now, let's leave the convulsive, terrifying fields of Europe behind. Let's travel in our minds, over the seas and across the deserts, to the mountains of the Middle East, because while Europeans were accidentally poisoning themselves with fungus, and having terrifying trips on nightshades, a much more calm and contemplative high was brewing. We're talking about the discovery of hashish and a completely different approach to altering consciousness. The story, as legends tell it, begins with a reclusive Sufi mystic named Haydar, who was living a quiet life of contemplation in the mountains of Persia around the 12th century. Haydar was known for his piety, but also suffered from bouts of deep depression. One sunny afternoon, while walking through the fields, he idly plucked and chewed the leaves of a plant he had never noticed before, the cannabis plant. And as the plant's properties took hold, he felt a profound change. Suddenly, his lifelong burden of depression and anxiety simply melted away. He was so filled with a sense of peace and euphoric joy that he ran back to his monastery to share his discovery with his followers. He called it the wine of Haydar. And for these Sufi mystics, this was not a party drug. There was no concept of using it to just get silly and goof off. For them, hashish was a sacred tool, a sacrament. It was a key that could unlock a hidden door in the mind, a way to get closer to God. They truly believed it quieted the distracting chatter of the conscious mind, allowing for deeper, more focused meditation and a more profound connection to the divine. It was seen as a vehicle for spiritual insight, a way to perceive the beauty of God's creation in every leaf and every stone. It became so intertwined with their identity that for centuries, hashish was known throughout the Islamic world as the tea of the Sufis, or the wine of Haydar. Alright, let's shift gears completely now. Take a deep breath and let the image of those Persian mountains fade. We're going to travel from the inner journeys of the mind to the outer journeys across the sea. We're heading back in time to ancient Greece, to the shimmering blue of the Aegean Sea. We're here to talk about the powerhouse of the Athenian navy and its ultimate weapon, a sleek, deadly, and revolutionary ship called the trireme. First things first, forget everything you've seen in old movies like Ben-Hur, with miserable, shackled slaves being whipped to row faster. That's a Roman thing, and even then, it's often exaggerated. The rowers on an Athenian trireme were the absolute backbone of the empire, the heart that pumped its lifeblood, and they were free citizens. In fact, they were often the poorest citizens, the thetes, and this was their primary way of serving and influencing their city. And make no mistake, these guys were not unskilled labourers. They were highly trained, well-paid professionals. Powering a trireme wasn't about having the biggest muscles. It was about perfect, synchronized timing, incredible endurance, and the discipline to work as a single, cohesive unit. Each rower was a critical gear in a complex and very fast-moving machine. One person out of sync could throw off the entire bank of oars. Now, try to imagine the conditions. Picture a long, narrow wooden ship, maybe 120 feet long but only 18 feet wide. Now, cram 170 rowers into that tiny space, arranged in 3 staggered tiers on top of each other. It was brutally hot, it was unbelievably smelly, and it was so incredibly cramped that you were constantly bumping elbows with the men next to you. The very concept of personal space was not a thing on a trireme. The air inside that wooden shell would have been thick and heavy with the smell of sweat, unwashed bodies, worn leather, and the hot tar used to seal the ship's planks. The only rhythm, the only sound that mattered, was the constant, hypnotic beat of the coxswain's drum. That beat was their heartbeat, their metronome, keeping all 170 oars moving in perfect fluid sync, in and out, for hours on end. Their diet was as basic as you can get, but it was designed for high energy output. The main staple was a kind of hard barley biscuit or bread, often eaten with onions, garlic, and maybe a bit of cheese or a few olives if they were lucky. Water was strictly rationed and often not very fresh, so it was almost always mixed with wine. The alcohol helped kill off some of the bacteria and provided a few extra calories for the grueling work ahead. These guys were, quite literally, the engine of the ship. Their entire job was to propel this 120-foot-long wooden missile through the water at incredible speeds. In short bursts, a well-trained crew could get a trireme up to 9 knots, or about 10 miles per hour. That may not sound like much to us, but for a 25-ton, human-powered boat, it was blisteringly fast, and it was the key to their entire naval strategy. Because the whole point of a trireme wasn't to fight a cannon battle or even to board another ship. Its primary function was to ram. The front of the ship was fitted with a massive, terrifying bronze ram, often weighing over 400 pounds. This ram was designed to do one thing: punch a huge, splintering hole in the side of an enemy vessel below the waterline, sinking it within minutes. Victory in a trireme battle depended entirely on speed and maneuverability. The crew had to be able to execute incredibly complex turns, sudden stops, and lightning-fast bursts of speed on the coxswain's command. The goal was to outmaneuver the enemy, get on their flank, and deliver that one perfect, fatal blow. In the hands of a skilled crew, the trireme wasn't just a boat, it was a bronze-tipped spear. For the men who did this work, being a rower was a profound source of pride and, more importantly, power. The trireme fleet was a truly democratic force. It gave the poorest men in Athens a crucial role in defending their city, and because the city depended on them for its survival, they couldn't be ignored. Serving as a rower gave them a real stake in the fate of their city, and that stake translated directly into political power back home in the assembly. Now, let's pack our bags and jump forward a couple hundred years on the timeline. We're heading west across the Mediterranean to the Italian peninsula and the rising power of Rome. The Romans were absolute masters of warfare on land. Their legions were disciplined, organized, and nearly unbeatable. But when it came to the sea, they were, to put it mildly, toddlers in a bathtub. They had almost no naval tradition and were frankly terrified of the open ocean. This was a huge problem because their new arch-rival, the city of Carthage in North Africa, was a naval superpower. The Carthaginians were expert sailors who had dominated the seas for centuries. In the early naval battles of their first major conflict, the First Punic War, the Romans were getting their butts kicked, repeatedly. They knew they couldn't win a traditional naval battle of ramming and maneuvering. They just weren't good enough. So, they did what the Romans always did best. When faced with a problem they couldn't solve, they changed the rules of the game. If you can't win their fight, make them fight yours. They invented a device that was as simple as it was brilliant, as clumsy as it was effective. It was called the corvus, which is the Latin word for crow or raven, named for its beak-like shape. The corvus was basically a giant, movable boarding bridge that they attached to the front of their ships. It was over 30 feet long and about 4 feet wide. But the real genius was at the end of it, a heavy, pointed spike made of iron. The whole thing was held upright by a system of pulleys and ropes. The idea was simple and brutally effective, a perfect example of Roman battlefield engineering. Here's how it worked: a Roman ship, which didn't need to be particularly fast or agile, would just sail up alongside an enemy Carthaginian ship. Once they were close enough, they would just cut the rope, and this massive, 1-ton bridge would drop down and slam onto the enemy's deck. That heavy iron spike would pierce their deck planks, locking the two ships together so they couldn't pull apart. And just like that, In the thunderous crash of splintering wood, the entire nature of the battle changed. It wasn't a naval battle anymore, a contest of wind and oars and sailing skill. It was a land battle on water. It was a street fight on the waves. And absolutely nobody in the ancient world beats the Romans in a land battle. Before the shocked Carthaginian sailors could even process what had happened, disciplined, heavily armed Roman legionaries would storm across the bridge, turning their ship into a bloody, close-quarters killing field. It worked like an absolute charm at first. The Carthaginians, for all their naval genius, had no answer for this. Their sleek, fast ships were suddenly trapped, their skilled sailors forced to fight hand-to-hand against the best infantry in the world. The Corvus was the key to Rome's first major naval victories, like the Battle of Mylae, completely turning the tide of the First Punic War. It was a game-changer, but the Corvus, for all its simple brilliance, had a massive, fatal flaw. The entire apparatus was incredibly heavy, weighing well over a ton, and it was mounted high up on the ship's bow to give it leverage. This design choice, while necessary for its function, did something terrible to the ship's balance. It made the Roman quinquiremes dangerously top-heavy and terribly unstable in anything but the calmest water. In the glassy, gentle seas of a perfect summer day, it was fine. You could sail along, drop your bridge, and conquer the enemy. But in a real Mediterranean storm, with high winds and churning waves, that high center of gravity was a death sentence. As the ship rolled in the waves, the immense weight of the Corvus up top would create a pendulum effect, causing the ship to tip further and further, until it just kept going, capsizing and taking everyone on board down with it. The scale of the disasters was apocalyptic. The Romans lost entire fleets, not to the skilled sailors of Carthage, but to bad weather. In one storm in 255 BC, the Romans lost almost 300 ships and nearly 100 Zallos and men. A few years later, another 150 ships were lost in another storm. We're talking about thousands of ships and tens of thousands of experienced soldiers and sailors lost, all because of this one clumsy, brilliant, and ultimately cursed invention. Eventually, after these catastrophic losses, they just ditched it. As the wars dragged on, Roman naval skills and ship designs improved to the point where they could compete with the Carthaginians on their own terms. They didn't need their training wheels anymore. The Corvus was a temporary, bloody, but in the end, a successful solution to a very big problem. It allowed them to survive long enough to become true masters of the sea. Now, let's let the memory of those Roman fleets sink beneath the waves and move forward in time. We're traveling to the great city of Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire, the inheritors of Rome's Eastern legacy. The Byzantines were a fortress in a hostile world. They faced constant threats from all sides, Arabs, Bulgars, Vikings, but they had a secret weapon. A weapon so terrifying, so mysterious, it became the stuff of legends for 1,000 years: Greek fire. Now, I want you to erase the image of a simple fire arrow from your mind. This was not just regular fire. This was a sticky, liquid incendiary substance that could be sprayed from bronze siphons mounted on the front of their ships. It was pressurized, likely using a pump and nozzle system, turning their naval vessels into something straight out of a dragon's nightmare. Think of it as a medieval flamethrower, but so much worse. What made Greek fire so uniquely terrifying was its chemical nature, its most horrifying quality. It could not be put out with water. In fact, throwing water on it seemed to make it burn even hotter and more violently. It would cling to the wood of ships, to the clothes of sailors, to anything it touched, and it would just keep burning. It even burned on the surface of the water itself, meaning you couldn't even save yourself by jumping overboard. Just try to imagine being an enemy sailor. You're part of a massive fleet sailing to attack the richest city in the world. You see the smaller Byzantine ships coming towards you, and you're not afraid. And then, suddenly, a thick stream of roaring liquid fire shoots across the water. It hits your ship, and the world just explodes into a hellscape of clinging, inextinguishable flame. There is no escape. There is no defense. It is pure liquid terror. The psychological impact was immense, and the Byzantines knew it. It was a weapon of terror as much as a weapon of war. It created sheer panic. Entire enemy fleets, brave men who were not afraid of sword or spear, would break formation and flee at the mere sight of the siphons being prepared on the Byzantine ships. They weren't just fighting a navy, they were fighting a monster. The exact recipe for Greek fire was the most closely guarded state secret of the Byzantine Empire. It was on par with a modern nuclear code. The formula was known to only a handful of people and was passed down from one emperor to the next. To reveal the secret, or to allow the equipment to be captured, was the highest form of treason, a crime for which there was no mercy. To this day, we still don't know the exact chemical composition. The secret was kept so well that it was eventually lost to history forever. But based on ancient descriptions of its properties, modern historians and chemists believe it was likely a petroleum-based mixture, probably using crude oil or naphtha, combined with other fun ingredients like sulfur, pine resin, and maybe quicklime, which would react with water to generate heat. This terrifying invention was no mere curiosity. It was a war winner. Greek fire single-handedly saved the capital city of Constantinople on multiple occasions, most famously during two massive Arab sieges in the 7th and 8th centuries. Naval assaults that should have easily overwhelmed the city's defences were utterly destroyed by this liquid nightmare. Without it, the Byzantine Empire, and with it the repository of classical Greek and Roman knowledge, would have almost certainly fallen centuries earlier than it did. Alright, let's take another big leap. We're stepping back in the ancient Near East to a time before Rome was even a big deal, a time of bronze and iron and epic empires. The year is around 550 BC. For centuries, this part of the world has been dominated by a handful of superpowers, old and formidable empires that had carved up the known world between them. You had the Maids, the Lydians, and the greatest of them all, the Neo-Babylonians. These were old, powerful kingdoms, rich in culture, steeped in tradition, and backed by immense military might. They were the giants of their age. To the people living at the time, these empires probably seemed eternal, permanent fixtures of the world, as solid as the mountains themselves. But they were all about to be swept away, like sandcastles in a tidal wave, by one man from a small, upstart kingdom called Persia. His name was Cyrus, a name that would echo through history, followed by the title, he earned the Great. And he wasn't just another conqueror in a long line of brutal warlords. He wasn't interested in just tearing things down and salting the earth. He was a genuine revolutionary, a man who would change the very idea of what it meant to rule an empire. His rise was meteoric. First, through a clever mix of diplomacy and battle, he united the Persian and Median kingdoms under his own rule, creating a massive new power seemingly overnight. Then, he turned his attention west, to the Lydian Empire in modern-day Turkey, an empire famous for its almost mythical wealth and its king, Croesus, who was said to be the richest man in the world. Cyrus conquered him and took his kingdom. After his stunning victories over the Maids and the Lydians, only one great power remained standing in his way, the final boss, the mighty city of Babylon, the glittering jewel of Mesopotamia, the largest and most magnificent city in the world at the time, ruled by its king, Nabonidus. Conquering Babylon would mean conquering the world. But Babylon was considered utterly impregnable, a military impossibility. The city was surrounded by a legendary system of double walls, so high and so thick that no army had ever managed to breach them. On top of that, the great Euphrates River flowed right through the heart of the city, passing under the walls, which not only provided an endless supply of fresh water during a siege, but also made the walls themselves impossible to undermine with tunnels. A direct assault on those walls was pure suicide. You could throw an army at them for a year and accomplish nothing but creating a mountain of your own dead. A traditional siege trying to starve the city out would be just as useless. With the Euphrates River flowing through it, Babylon could hold out for years, maybe even decades. So Cyrus, realizing that brute force was off the table, came up with a plan that was so simple, so elegant, and so audacious it was pure genius. As the Greek historian Herodotus tells the story, Cyrus knew he couldn't beat the walls, so he decided to use the city's own greatest strength, the river, against it. He patiently waited for the perfect moment, a major annual Babylonian festival. He knew this would be a night of city-wide celebration, a night when the guards on the walls would be distracted, when the city's leadership would be deep in their cups, and when the general population would be lost in feasting and revelry. While the city prepared to party, Cyrus's army was hard at work. Opriva from Babylon, he had his men dig a series of massive trenches and canals, leading away from the Euphrates and into a huge, empty lake basin nearby that had been dug by a previous queen. It was a massive feat of engineering, all done quietly and out of sight. The plan was not to attack the river, but to simply move it. Then, on the night of the festival, as the sounds of music and celebration echoed from the city, Cyrus gave the order. His men broke the banks of the Euphrates, and the mighty river began to pour out of its natural channel and into the man-made marshland. The water level in the river that ran through the city began to drop, and drop, and drop. Within hours, the powerful river had been reduced to a stream barely more than thigh-deep. Under the cover of darkness, the elite soldiers of the Persian army slipped into the now tame riverbed. They waded silently through the shallow water, approaching the city walls from a direction no one would ever expect. The massive water gates, which were normally deep underwater and protected by heavy grates, were now exposed and easily bypassed. The Persian army entered the mighty city of Babylon without breaking down a single gate or climbing a single wall. They were completely unopposed. The Babylonians were so busy with their festival, so lost in their drunken celebrations, that they didn't even realize what was happening until it was far, far too late. Herodotus claims that the city was so enormous that the outer parts of it were captured and falling to the Persians before the people in the very center of the city even knew that they were under attack. The party only stopped when Persian soldiers showed up in the banquet hall, and just like that, it was over. Babylon, the greatest, richest, and most powerful city in the world, the city that was thought to be unconquerable, fell in a single night without a major battle. Cyrus the Great had conquered a superpower not with swords and siege engines, but with shovels and a brilliant idea. He had taken the Queen of Cities without shedding a drop of blood at her gates. But what Cyrus did next is the reason we still talk about him today. It's what truly made him great. Because in the ancient world, conquest was an ugly, brutal business. Victory usually meant one thing for the conquered: misery. Cities were looted, temples were desecrated, people were slaughtered or enslaved, and entire cultures were erased. That was just how things were done. The Assyrian kings who had ruled the region just a generation before Cyrus, for example, took a perverse pride in their own cruelty. They carved their military victories into stone monuments, not just as a record, but as a warning. They would boast in their official inscriptions about flaying their enemies alive, of building pyramids out of human skulls, and of burning cities to the ground so that nothing but ash remained. They wanted to rule through pure, abject terror. Their official accounts of their campaigns were designed to make your blood run cold, filled with lines like, "I dyed the mountains with their blood like red wool," or "I fed their chopped-up corpses to the dogs and the vultures." This was the accepted model of kingship. This was what power looked like. Cyrus was different. After taking the city, he didn't unleash his soldiers to pillage and destroy. Instead, he issued a proclamation, an official decree inscribed on a small clay barrel that we now call the Cyrus cylinder. It is, without exaggeration, one of the most important artifacts in all of human history, a tiny object that represents a massive turning point in our collective story. Instead of bragging about his military genius or the might of his armies, the text on the cylinder describes how he, Cyrus, was chosen by the Babylonians' own god, Marduk, to restore order. It talks about how he intended to rule with justice and mercy, to heal the city, not harm it. He presented himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as a liberator. And then he backed it up with actions that were simply unheard of at the time. He allowed all the conquered peoples within the Babylonian Empire to keep their own religions and their own local customs. He didn't force anyone to worship his gods. Most famously, he freed the many displaced communities that had been forcibly relocated by the Babylonians, including the Jewish people who had been held captive in Babylon for decades, and he gave them permission, and even funding, to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their sacred temple. This was a completely radical, revolutionary new model of empire. It was an empire based not on fear and oppression, but on a surprising degree of tolerance and multiculturalism. Cyrus understood that you could rule more effectively by earning people's loyalty and respect rather than their hatred and fear. It was not only more humane, it was also much more stable. For this very reason, that little clay barrel, the Cyrus cylinder, is sometimes referred to as the world's first charter of human rights. While that's a bit of a modern interpretation, there's no denying that it established a precedent for a more humane, more tolerant, and more successful form of government that would become the defining characteristic of the Persian Empire for the next 2 centuries. Okay, let's let the dust settle on the fallen city of Babylon and shift our focus from the grand scale of battlefields and politics to something a little more personal, but in its own way, just as powerful: hair. We don't often think of it this way, but throughout history, the stuff that grows on our heads has been a potent and deeply meaningful symbol of power, of identity, and often of rebellion. Let's start our journey in a familiar place, the Roman Empire, but let's look at it through the eyes of its most powerful women. The Roman empresses, the wives of the emperors, women like the formidable Livia and the striking Julia Domna, were the fashion icons of their day. Their portraits were everywhere, on statues and on coins. But their elaborate hairstyles were so much more than just trends. They were carefully crafted political statements, silent broadcasts to the entire empire. Let's take Livia, the wife of the very first emperor, Augustus. As Augustus was carefully trying to pretend he wasn't a king and was just restoring the republic, Livia wore her hair in a simple, modest, almost severe style called the nodus. It was meant to project an image of traditional Roman virtue, republican simplicity, and strong family values. It was a hairstyle that said, "We are not decadent monarchs, we are just first among equals." It was a carefully crafted piece of visual propaganda. Now, let's jump forward nearly 2 centuries to Julia Domna, the Syrian-born wife of the soldier emperor Septimius Severus. By this point, the pretense of the Republic was long gone. Julia sported a massive, elaborate wig with perfectly symmetrical waves and complex curls, a style that looked less like hair and more like a helmet or a crown. This style projected immense wealth, untouchable power, and an almost divine status. It was a symbol of a new, more openly autocratic era of Roman rule. You see, these women used their hair to communicate the core values and the political realities of their husband's reign. It was a silent, visual language of power, one that was instantly understood by everyone in the empire, from a senator in Rome to a merchant in Alexandria. Just by looking at the empress's portrait on a coin, you could get a sense of the entire political climate. But hair could also be a powerful tool of defiance for those who had no political power at all, for those who were considered property. Let's travel from the marble halls of Rome to the sweltering heat of 17th century Colombia during the brutal era of the transatlantic slave trade. And let me tell you the story of a man named Benkos Bayoa. It's a story of incredible courage, ingenuity, and rebellion, all centered around hair. Benkos Bayo was said to have been an African king from the Bisagos Islands off the coast of Guinea-Bissau before he was captured and sold into slavery in what is now Colombia. But a king does not forget how to lead. He escaped his captors and fled into the swamps and forests, where he founded Palenque de San Basilio, a fortified community of other escaped slaves. who were known as Maroons. It was one of the very first free towns in the Americas. Bios organized raids to free more slaves from the nearby plantations, but he needed a way to guide them to the safety of Palenque without alerting the slave owners. So, the women of the community developed an incredible, covert system of communication. They would braid intricate hairstyles into their hair, or the hair of those planning to escape. And these beautiful, complex braids weren't just decorative, they were maps. Each braid, each twist, each part was a symbol. A thick braid might represent a main road to avoid, while a thin one could be a secret path through the jungle. Curved braids could map the winding course of a river. Knots or buns could indicate the location of a mountain, a landmark, or even a hidden rebel outpost. And in an act of incredible foresight, women would even braid seeds, like rice or millet, deep into their hair, creating a tiny, hidden seed bank to plant and grow food once they finally reached the safety of Palenque. It was a brilliant and utterly covert system of communication, using something the slave owners would see every day but never truly look at. They would dismiss it as just a hairstyle, never realizing they were looking at a blueprint for liberation. A woman's hair became a secret message, a survival kit, and a promise of a new life. It was a profound act of rebellion hidden in plain sight. This brings us to another, much darker story of hair and control, one where the state, not the individual, wielded the power. Let's travel across the world to 17th century China. The Ming dynasty had fallen, and the nation had been conquered by the Manchus, a people from the north. They established a new dynasty, the Qing, and they were a minority ruling over a vast Han Chinese majority. To consolidate their power and crush the cultural identity of the hundreds of millions of people they now ruled, the Manchu government issued one of the most infamous orders in Chinese history, the Q Order. It was a policy of forced assimilation aimed directly at the head of every single man in the empire. The order was simple and absolute. Every Han Chinese man was forced to adopt the Manchu hairstyle. This involved shaving the entire front of the head and then wearing the rest of the hair grown out in a long, single braid called a queue. This was not just a suggestion, it was a law enforced by the military with the most brutal of consequences. The slogan used to enforce this new policy was as brutal and direct as the policy itself: lose your hair or lose your head. There was no middle ground. You either adopted the hairstyle of your conquerors or you were executed as a rebel. It was a simple, daily, visual test of loyalty to the new regime. For Han Chinese men, this was a profound and deeply painful humiliation. It wasn't about fashion, it was about identity and filial piety. Traditional Confucian values taught that your body, including your hair, was a gift from your parents and ancestors, and that it was disrespectful to cut it. For centuries, Han men had worn their hair long and tied up in a top knot. To shave it was to sever a connection to their culture, their family, and their own sense of self. The queue became the ultimate symbol of submission to a foreign power. As you can imagine, this did not go over well. For decades, the Q Order sparked massive and incredibly bloody rebellions across China. Entire cities were massacred for resisting the order. Literally millions of men chose to die with their ancestral hair intact rather than adopt the hairstyle of their conquerors. But the policy was enforced with ruthless efficiency. The Qing government understood that if they could control a man's head, they could control the man. It was a powerful and visual way to separate loyal subjects from rebels. Every single day, you could tell who was who with just a single glance. A man's hairstyle became a life or death political statement. So you see, in all of these cases, from the carefully sculpted wigs of Roman empresses to the secret maps in the braids of Colombian escapees to the forced queues of Chinese rebels, hair was never, ever just hair. It was a canvas for projecting power, for preserving identity, and for staging desperate acts of defiance. It could be a carefully calibrated symbol of imperial authority, a secret map to freedom, or a non-negotiable reason to fight and die for your culture. It proves that the most personal things can also be the most political, that even the smallest choices we make about our appearance can carry the weight of history. Now let's explore how hair was used in a more direct and aggressive way by warriors and empires as a weapon of intimidation and a badge of honor. Think of the Vikings, whose very name conjures images of their long, often braided hair and thick, formidable beards. This wasn't just a rugged look, it was a core part of their fierce, wild, and free identity. It was a visual statement that they did not belong to the settled, clean-shaven world of Christian Europe. Or think of the Scythians, the legendary nomadic horse warriors of the Eurasian steppe. The ancient Greeks wrote about them with a mix of fear and fascination. Scythian men were known for their long, flowing hair, which they would often tie in a distinctive top knot. On a practical level, it was a simple way to keep their hair out of their eyes while riding at full gallop and firing a bow. But it was also a powerful cultural marker. For cultures like these, long hair wasn't just about looking scary to their enemies, though it certainly helped. It was a deeply ingrained symbol of their freedom, their connection to the natural world, and their outright rejection of the so-called civilized. Look of the great empires to the south, like Persia or Rome. To be clean-shaven and short-haired was to be tamed. To be long-haired was to be wild and free. Now let's go to a place that was anything but wild, the hyper-disciplined city-state of ancient Sparta. Here, hair was not a matter of personal choice. It had a very specific set of rules that were tied to a man's age and status. When a boy was young, his head was kept shaved. This symbolized his youth and his subordinate position in Spartan society. But as he grew into a man and a warrior, he was allowed to grow his hair long. For a Spartan warrior, long hair was a powerful symbol of his status as a free man, a citizen, someone who did not have to perform manual labor and could dedicate his entire life to the art of war. It was a visible mark of the warrior elite, a privilege earned through surviving the brutal Spartan training regimen, the agoge. In a society that shunned material wealth and jewelry, a man's long hair was one of his primary status symbols. And what they did with that hair is fascinating. Before a battle, Spartan warriors would famously and meticulously spend time combing and dressing their long hair, often braiding it into intricate styles. It was a solemn ritual, a moment of calm and focus. It was a way of beautifying themselves for what they saw as the ultimate test of their worth, a way of preparing themselves mentally and spiritually for the fight to come. It was a quiet statement of their courage and their acceptance of their fate. On the complete opposite side of that cultural coin, you have the Roman legions. In stark contrast to the long-haired Spartans or Gauls, Roman soldiers were required by military regulation to keep their hair short and be clean-shaven. This wasn't a fashion statement, it was a practical and deeply symbolic policy. On a practical level, short hair was better for hygiene in crowded army camps, and it gave an enemy less to grab onto in close-quarters combat. But the symbolism was even more important. It was about discipline, uniformity, and the Roman ideal of order. A Roman legion was supposed to be a single, unified, unstoppable fighting machine. The individual soldier's identity was secondary to the identity of the unit. Individuality was suppressed in favor of the collective, the whole. Short hair and a clean-shaven face was the visual representation of that military ideal. It said, "I am not a unique warrior. I am a cog in the machine of Rome. My strength comes from my brothers standing next to me, who look exactly as I do." So, when these two worlds clashed on the battlefield, the long-haired, bearded, barbarian warrior and the short-haired, clean-shaven Roman soldier, it was so much more than just a battle of armies. It was a visual and visceral battle of cultures, of two completely different ways of seeing the world. It was a conflict between the wild and the tamed, the individual and the collective, symbolized by something as simple and profound as a haircut. Now let's shift our gaze east, from the forests of Europe to the grand, ancient empires of the Near East, like Assyria and Persia. If you look at the carvings and reliefs they left behind, Their kings and nobles are almost always depicted with magnificent, long, and elaborately curled hair and beards. These weren't just natural styles, they were masterpieces of cosmetic art, requiring hours of care, oils, and maybe even hot irons to achieve. And this, again, was not just a fashion choice. These intricate, almost sculptural styles were powerful symbols of divine authority, of wisdom, and of immense royal power. They were meant to elevate the king above the level of ordinary mortals, to make him look like something more than just a man. The sheer time and resources required to maintain such a look was in itself a statement of wealth and power. To the Greeks and later the Romans, who valued a more natural and athletic look, this Persian style seemed exotic, decadent, and even effeminate. They often used it in their own art and literature as a kind of shorthand for foreign luxury and moral weakness. But to the Persians, it was a proud and ancient symbol of their heritage, their connection to the gods, and the majesty of their king. In this way, hair became a sharp cultural dividing line. It was a simple, visible way of saying, "We are not you." In a world where empires constantly tried to absorb and assimilate their neighbors, maintaining your traditional hairstyle could be a quiet, but very powerful form of resistance. It was a declaration of cultural independence that you wore on your head every single day. This power of hair as an identity marker becomes even clearer when we look at societies where people were enslaved. Stripping an enslaved person of their identity, breaking their connection to their past and their people, very often began with the brutal and humiliating act of shaving their head. It was a violent way of saying, "You are no one. You have no past. You belong to me now." But even in the face of this brutality, whenever and wherever they could, enslaved people used their hair to preserve their culture and their lineage in secret. As we saw in Colombia, braids could tell stories. They could conceal valuable seeds for a future garden, or they could hold secret messages. A hairstyle could be a silent act of remembering, a way to carry your home with you when everything else had been taken away. Women, too, have always used their hair to push back against social norms and make powerful statements without saying a word. In ancient Sparta, for example, unmarried young women famously wore their hair short, in stark contrast to the long, flowing locks of women in Athens and other Greek city-states. This was not a fashion trend, it was a statement. This short hairstyle was a symbol of their unique position in Greek society. It was a statement of their independence, their athleticism, and their readiness for the rigorous physical activity that was a core part of Spartan life for both men and women. It signaled that they were not delicate, sheltered creatures, but strong and capable members of a warrior society. Later, in the Roman Empire, some women began to consciously reject the incredibly elaborate and expensive hairstyles of the imperial court. By adopting much simpler, more modest styles, perhaps just a simple bun or a braid, they could signal their alignment with different values. It could be a way of showing adherence to philosophical ideals like Stoicism, which preached simplicity and a rejection of vanity, or it could signal their conversion to the new and growing religion of Christianity. It was a quiet, personal rebellion against what they saw as the decadence, the vanity, and the moral corruption of the ruling class. In a world of towering wigs and jewel-encrusted braids, a simple hairstyle could be the most radical statement of all. It was a way of saying, "My worth is not on my head, but in my character." And this connection between hair and politics was so strong that when an emperor was overthrown and killed, his signature hairstyle often fell with him. In the chaotic aftermath of a coup, men in the Roman elite might rush to their barbers to change their haircut. Getting rid of the old emperor's style could be a very risky, but very clear and public way to show your new political allegiance and save your own skin. In all of these cases, from the blood-soaked battlefields of Gaul to the perfumed halls of the imperial court, to the desperate secrecy of the slave quarters, hair was never a passive thing. It wasn't just a mirror that reflected the world around it. It was a tool that people actively used to try and shape that world, to find their place in it, and sometimes to fight back against it. It could be a symbol of absolute military discipline or of wild, untamed freedom. It could be a declaration of divine royal power broadcast from a king's throne, or it could be a secret message of rebellion whispered through the twists of a braid. Hair was a language all its own, spoken by everyone, everywhere. It's incredible, really. Across so many ancient civilizations, in times when people's voices were silenced, when their lands were taken, or when swords were drawn, the human scalp itself became a canvas of resistance, a last bastion of identity that could be controlled, shaped, and used to send a message. A braid, a buzz cut, a curl. Sometimes these simple things could shout louder and more eloquently than words ever dared. They could carry the weight of tradition, the hope of freedom, and the fire of defiance. They were stories told without a sound. And it's a powerful reminder for us, I think, that the most personal things about us, the way we wear our hair, the clothes we choose, the way we carry ourselves through the world, are often deeply and invisibly connected to the biggest and most dramatic stories in human history. We are all, in our own small way, walking, talking history books. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey tonight. I hope it gave you some interesting things to think about as you drift off. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed spending this time together. I'll see you next time for another dive into our weird and wonderful past. Sleep well.